Thank you. Also, Craig will join me. Craig's from the architect, so I think the main reason why we're here is to look at the master plan of the Tallinn port, but also look at the vision document of the Tallinn seaside and then make sure they align and one. So besides us, there's also Mari, Taavi, Tanel, Margus, Piret, Toomas, Indrek and Ülar, who's part of our groups. They sit around here, so if you feel free to jump in. I'll probably have to hand the microphone. Okay, so that's the first slide of the vision document, and the real. Is this working? Is that? I think it's somewhere there. Ah, it is. Can I go back? Okay, that's back. Okay, thank you. So it's essentially aligning. Look at how these two kind of projects or documents how they align, and so because one is you can say that this is looking from the city side towards the sea, and this one perhaps looks from the other side towards the city. So and it's important how these two connect. So one of the main topics we talked about is actually who's the owner of the space, and I'll go back to the very first slide, and then this in the vision document it's actually defined in two colors, black and white. So black is the one sort of privately owned plots, and the white is the public space. Now we think that it shouldn't be the one and the same owner or the guardian of the space, so to speak. So if the black plots are actually cared or looked after by the owners or by the kind of retailers, and then the public space needs to be either looked after by the Port of Tallinn or by the City of Tallinn. So we really want to avoid the situation where the public streets and the public spaces are also maintained by the people, by the functions that actually are close to these spaces, because we know what may happen. That actually the public space gets closed down, and then it's public only from 9 to 5. And or actually more likely closed at 10. So how to avoid this situation? This is one of the key questions here. But moving forward, we also think that it's important to define what's the structure of the public space. So it's public plazas, but also the streets. And defining that is actually a very important question, as we've seen actually in case of Old Town, for example, that the street network is the one thing that stays. So buildings change, functions change, public transport, the street network that stays for hundreds of years, more than that. While other functions can change. But I'll hand to Craig and maybe talk about the public space of the master plan.
Firstly, let me kind of thank everybody for coming as well. A special thanks to everybody in our group. I think we had an incredibly positive dialogue. Of course, there were a lot of opinions that were communicated. But overall, I think the discussion was very positive, and we have a lot to take away when we develop our work to the next stage. And a special thanks to Jan Gale for coming here and supporting the workshops. So in terms of the structure of the public space, I think we need to start with the streets. And hopefully everybody, I think that's one of the messages that came out from our group, is that we need to consider the streets as public space and how they contribute to the life and the structure of the overall kind of master plan itself. Within then the street structure, and there's a number of hierarchies that we need to consider when we develop the master plan to the next level, that within each of the quarters as we've defined them, that there are specific larger public spaces that give those quarters identity. So we're not, and then around those streets or within the streets and around those public spaces, we would like to try to activate those spaces as much as we can. Of course, it's not in terms of what Jan mentioned about retail washing, that we need to consider how that works economically, and as well how that works with regards to the movement of people within the master plan area and between the city center and the master plan area. So those red routes or hot routes that have, say, more activity on them, they're obviously going to support those shops and retail uses to a much higher degree than the streets that don't have that level of activity. So when we consider the movement, not just of local people, because the places for local people is not just for visitors and for tourists. When we consider the kind of the connectivity between the existing fabric across Reedy Road and the development area, as well as with the traffic or the pedestrian movement from the cruise ships and the ferry ships, then how does that begin to inform and activate those routes back to the city center? So,
thanks. So the question is, how do you actually make the seaside accessible after every 100 meters, as defined in the vision document? It's not perhaps as straightforward as just trying to grid on it. But we did actually look at what are the main connections and how the master plan should reflect this. And there's been two competitions recently. One is the Tallinn High Street that looks the area here in the current city center. There's been a second competition that's been particularly looking for these connections and how they possibly go over Ahtri. But that's essentially the line where the two interfaces need to meet of the current city and the new master plan area. So these become very important areas. So I don't think there's been actually a major discussion how to get across of Ahtri, but that's maybe not the topic of this forum either. Right, and then we also discussed of that these main pedestrian routes that connect the city to the harbor and vice versa needs to be somehow activated. So the activation should happen via the active fronts of the ground floor, and there's possibly some lack of these active street frontages where we mark them with pink. And we possibly it can be activated with the pop-up functions, temporary functions, while the city is actually being built. Now, Michael, that's just your drawing actually. Maybe you can.
So, in addition to the kind of the ground, and you're going to talk about the ground floor areas, how the kind of the transitional kind of uses. So, ideally, having kind of active uses on the ground level, and then how we think about striating the buildings, the building use, or the uses within individual buildings, both horizontally and vertically. And it's something that came out of a discussion that we had with the chap from Huffin City as well, is they considered that when on the backs of buildings, the views and the possible noise conditions, the acoustic conditions aren't commensurate with residential use, how can we divide the buildings vertically so we have office perhaps on one side and residential use on the other side facing the streets or more kind of, more pleasant spaces.
We realized that there is a problem because the area is such a big and it's not going to be developed at once. So the problem really is manifested in the transportation connections. There's a new tram line planned here, so this one would serve definitely this area and the port terminals. But this area is definitely too far from actually getting on the tram. So what's going to happen? So the very likely thing what's happened is that if that gets developed first, it's going to be developed as a car-oriented area. So how do you avoid it actually? And if you just develop that, it doesn't make sense to bring the public transport in yet, perhaps, because there's not enough demand yet. So this conundrum actually, how do you possibly solve it? So yes, we said that we definitely need some indication of the possible bus routes in the master plan. So because these need to be wider streets, and even before the bus lines come, it needs to be manifested in the master plan. But how do you actually deal with this situation? Is one of the possible ways to do it is to actually give some of the ground floor space in the initial developments for parking, but the story heights need to be high enough so it can be converted into retail or into offices or even residential at the later state. So we know the parking uses 2.2 meters, less than residential, definitely less than office and retail. So this could be possible. We're not saying that we should actually plan for entire initial developments as parking on the ground floor, but only maybe parts of it. But it should be able to convert it at the later stage when the entire area has been actually developed and there's less demand for parking because the public transport lines have been brought in. Well, that should be for the entire area. I think Tavi said that's okay. Yeah, and then this should be definitely not the 60 kilometers per hour. And obviously the design and the pedestrian areas need to be much lower than that. And the last slide is actually said that there is this demand in the area, and there's a danger of this area becoming sort of high-class development, and where investors come in and buy the flats and rent it out as Airbnb flats, and no local people actually come here. So we said that it's a political decision. It's not so much about the master plan, but there's a chance of actually developing a good professional rental market here. Maybe some of the areas need to be actually not allowed for renting out as Airbnb flats and or being given to actually some of the sort of rental managers who actually rent it for 6 months, for 1 year, which in turn kind of supports the idea that was expressed in the master plan as well, the local tech hub, so a kind of startup community. Those people don't come here for 2 days, 3 days to visit the city. They come here to actually work and and enjoy the city. Thank you. Did you want?
No, the only thing I would say is that, and I think that Gianluca mentioned yesterday, and probably Ludovico say as well, that the master plan is still at a conceptual level. So there's a limited amount of detail that we can adapt or that we can include in the work at this stage. But there's a lot of really useful knowledge that we got from the workshops here that we take away and try to implement as much as we can. So, thank you. Thanks.